Welcome to another episode of Joe Reagan's Conversations. And Joe, there is so much stuff flying around this week with the, crying out loud, the tariffs, stock market circling the drain. And I found out recently on a Facebook page, our illustrious congressman has closed his office here in town.
That one's new to me.
Yeah,
all right.
Well, so where are we going to start, Joe? I mean, the tariffs. Trump had just shot himself in a backside on this one.
So I always try and start. I think it's always good to start and say, if you really want to understand the level of incompetence that we're dealing with here, you have to understand what they're trying to do. If we take them for their word, right? I'm one of those people, I do not believe Donald Trump is a liar, because lying requires a level of competence that he does not have. So what he says might be lies, but I think he actually believes them. And so that would make him not necessarily a liar, just incompetent. So when Donald Trump talks about what he's trying to do, and the formula, by the way, they've used is completely ridiculous. Joe, do you know what you're talking about? Yes, I have a master's in business administration for a pretty decent school.
Let me genuflect on that one.
I'm not saying that to genuflect, because believe me, I'm not that smart. But when it comes to economic issues, I do know what I'm talking about. And so the formula they're using is completely ridiculous. And literally, every economist, I cannot find an economist anywhere on the internet that says this is a good idea. If you understand the global economy, obviously there are countries in this world where labor costs far less. And so when businesses are making the decision as to where they're going to manufacture products, labor factors into that. A lot of stuff we're seeing on social media pushes back on the fact that there were sitting members of Congress in the late 90s that were also looking at tariffs as being a solution to increased manufacturing that was occurring in China. Now, the late 90s, if anyone remembers, was very, very different economically. And so at the time, some of the thoughts on implementing tariffs to bring manufacturing back to the United States, it probably wasn't a good idea then, but the economic situation was much different. So in the late 90s, we're also coming off of kind of what they were referring to as the Asian tigers, right? So the Japanese market had really boomed through the 80s and then kind of crashed. You had a number of other Asian economies that had really, really swelled up and then crashed. And this was causing some disruptions in that space, that global trade space. And the U.S. really was trying to figure out, how do we compete with these Asian markets that can manufacture at such a low cost? And so tariffs was considered maybe part of that solution. And ultimately we decided, no, that's not a good idea, which was the right decision. And so now fast forward to today, the theory that the administration is operating off of is, if we push these tariffs to a certain point, then manufacturers will kind of be forced to relocate here to the United States and start manufacturing here in the United States. That's the theory, right? So that's the theory. The problem with that theory, Gary, do you know the lifespan for any sort of manufacturing facility?
Well, if it's like a shopping center, it's about 25 years.
So for some advanced manufacturing, it's 25, 30 years, in some cases even 50 years for like parts manufacturing. So when you're making the decision on where you're going to build a factory, you have to have the confidence that that manufacturing plant is going to be a revenue generating plant for a long period of time. And I think it's safe to say that regardless of what the next administration might look like, that certainty does not exist that this tariff regime would stay in place for 10 to 15 years. So the assumption that tariffs will bring manufacturing back is pretty faulty. And the market reflected that, right? So when we think of tariffs, and I had this conversation with someone the other day, right? The first impact that a tariff is going to have is on the market, because the market actually, it's not, those numbers are not real. Nothing changed between last week and today, besides the fact that a bunch of people that spend their entire lives making assessments as to what is the economy going to be worth 15 years from now, looked at the decisions that the Trump administration is making and saying, this is going to hurt the economy over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. And so that's what when we talk about the Dow and stuff like that, that's what we're talking about. That's why that impact happens so quickly. Traders are responding to what the perception of how these policies are going to impact overall growth over a period of time. So you hear the Trump people talking about how the Trump administration is really trying to focus on the 10-year Treasury bond. That's kind of the metric that they're focused on. And so the Treasury bond is not responding well, by the way. The Fed is not likely to raise rates. Yields on bonds is not likely to go up. And that all simply means that when you take all of the economic factors, and literally like half these books over here are talking about like the economics of how that stuff works. That, that's, it's not going to work.
Okay. If I could interject here.
Yep.
China, Russia, France, and Germany are dumping their U.S. bonds.
Yes.
They're dumping them, and they're going into Euro bonds and gold.
Yep.
Okay. Which isn't helping the situation. And circling back to the 90s when Japan had their issue and went into stagflation, I mean, that lasted almost 20 years.
Right.
So if we start doing a timeline of putting, okay, if we end up in stagflation, which there's predictions we will, we're looking at a 20-year window.
Yep.
Before we'll ever come out of it.
Yep.
And so getting back to your manufacturing plant, manufacturer wants to be guaranteed at least 20 years or 25 years of sustained growth and uninterrupted prosperity. Well, it ain't going to happen.
Right. And so on the bond issue, because we always hear this phrase like, oh, they're dumping the bonds.
Right.
Let's understand what that means too. Right. So at the end of the day, if you're selling a bond, that doesn't change anything for the finances of the United States government. Because at the end of the day, a bond is structured in such a way, the bond says, Treasury bond, I'm going to give you $100. You're going to give me a note that says you're going to give me my $100 back plus X, whatever the Fed rate is the day that bond is sold. So right now, the Fed rate's at like 4.6?
I heard 3 point something.
Is it 3 point something? It's gone. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you were to buy a 10-year Treasury bond today, that bond for $100, that bond is worth the $100 plus the 3.5% interest. People will trade that at different costs because of safety, right? If I believe that I can make more money without the bond, I sell the bond to somebody else. I use that money, I put it somewhere else. So that's how, but at the end of the day, the actual, and we don't do physical notes anymore, I don't think, but back in the old days, you used to have the actual physical savings bond with the little coupons that you would trade in for your interest. I do. See, I don't look that old, but I am that old.
Have you ever seen one?
I have.
Have you put one in your hand?
I did.
You did?
I was, that was when I was a baby. That was my grandparents gave me savings bonds. And I got to hold on to them. But, but So we hear about dumping bonds. What that really says, again, doesn't change the impact on the finances of the United States government. But what it does say is that all these people that hold these bonds believe they can make more money outside of the United States.
Right.
So, on the next level of that, you have this conversation around, well, back in the 1900s, tariffs this or tariffs that. Or if you go back, in fact, there's some great writing back and forth between Madison and one of the other founding fathers talking about tariffs and how that could be used to help grow the economy. The difference is, again, when we moved away, when all currency was tied to a commodity, gold, there was no fluctuation in the currency rate. Your nation had so much gold that was tied to the currency. So we all operated off the same standard. So there was no fluctuation in currency. When we separated from the gold standard, and then when you look at the marketplace that existed after post-World War II, and by the way, this is a wonderful podcast if you want to go to sleep, but now that we're talking about bonds. But if you go back to post-World War II, the idea was let's separate currency, because you can't, if your currency is tied to a commodity, you can't grow because you're tied to however much of that commodity that you have. And so go back to It's a Wonderful Life, right? Best summary of economics that exists in modern day theater of, hey, when you go to the bank, your money is not sitting in the bank. Your money is in your neighbor's house. Your money is in your neighbor's business. That's how we use finance to grow the marketplace. And is it unfair? Is it imperfect? Yes, of course. That's a much different conversation. But where we are today is the dollar adjusts its value based on foreign tariffs. So when China puts a tariff on the United States, and you'll hear this happen, the Chinese will actually manipulate their currency to increase its competition against the dollar. The dollar is not structured in the same way. The dollar is structured in a way that when a foreign country puts a tariff on us, the dollar actually gains purchasing power in that country, which really, it sounds counterintuitive. But to some extent, when a foreign country puts a tariff on the United States goods, your dollar buys more in that country, which, again, weird math, but that's the way the system is structured. So all of these conversations, all these arguments that say, oh, well, this is what we're trying to do with the tariffs, it's where it's rooted in, and it's all nonsense. And that's why the people that understand how the market works look at this and say, nope, it ain't working. Elon Musk said, not going to work. So what do we really have? In reality, so more history here. So again, if this is your bedtime routine, this is some good history to listen to. I need to get the NPR microphone so I can have the really deep voice. In 1765, the King of England put a number of tariffs and taxes on the colonies, which amounted to about a 3% tax on the colonies. If you look at the summary of all what we call the Intolerable Acts, it amounted to about a 3% tax on the colonies. The single largest increase in taxes to the American public occurred in the early 1900s, and that was when Congress implemented an actual income tax. Donald Trump just raised your taxes by 25%. It is the second largest tax increase in the history of the United States. Let me say that again. Donald Trump just raised your taxes by 25% minimum. The second largest tax increase in the history of the United States. Smaller than the tax the king put on the colonies that caused us to become a separate nation.
I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Does that tax apply to the oligarchs?
Well, technically it does, right? So this is the argument for when we talk about sales tax versus income tax. Mm-hmm. So people say, well, a sales tax, it's a consumption tax. So that should be fair. We don't need income tax. You should just be taxed on what you buy, which sounds great until you go back and say, if you're making, I mean, even at this point, I think even if you look at the high end of your middle income earners, a lot of those folks are still spending the majority of their paycheck. So they might be able, our higher income, our higher middle wage workers might be able to put some into savings, but still the majority of them are operating on a fairly tight budget, which means you're spending most of your money on buying stuff that you need to live, like food, like a car, like clothing. All of these things are that. So we talked about how the market responds first. Consumables come second. So your groceries, right? Your avocados from Mexico just went up 25%. You'll see that in about 2 weeks because, as the avocados work their way through the cycle.
You'll see it now because we were at the grocery store.
Yep.
And it was $1 a piece.
Yep.
And then they had a separate display of 3 avocados for $5.
Yep.
And
milk.
I'm used to
and milk will start. Yep. And milk will fit into this, and it just goes all the way down the line.
Right.
And the last place you'll see it is in the larger part of the market. So I had a conversation the other day with a business owner. He's like, well, I haven't seen my cost for manufacturing go up for this. I was like, well, it's because you're talking about buying manufacturing equipment that you probably only have to, again, the lifespan of this equipment, 10 to 15 years, if not more. Those prices get delayed because there's not a huge demand for it. So at the end of the day, you have a supply that exists. And because the volume is so low and these things don't go bad, that price is put off for a period of time. So when you really look at the impact of tariffs, this is a 2-year process, which, as someone pointed out to me, Joe, that these tariffs are going to get you elected next cycle. And I said, believe me, I would much rather get elected without the tariffs because this is going to cause a lot of pain. But that's how long this impact, we'll start to see these prices go up. So
if
tariffs,
I can interject here,
yep.
There's this website. It's a Facebook website or Facebook page that the people are just verbally beating the out of Jeff Crank. So I don't think you have to worry about the tariffs being hindering your election.
Well, so let's go back. Let's pivot then and talk about the fact that what you just said is he closed his office, and that to me over the past 2 months has been the most surprising aspect of this is the number of people that have reached out to me through my website reaganforcolorado.com, through Facebook, people that have run into me just around town. And be like, I wrote to Jeff Crank and he did not get back to me. I had a call today from someone that knows me pretty well that learned about a veteran that was having issues and needed some help. Couldn't get a hold of Jeff Crank. Well, I'll call Joe. Maybe he knows what to do. And thankfully I was able to connect him with a couple of different resources. So Jeff Crank should be paying me for doing his job already. I should be sending him invoices for all the stuff I'm doing to help. But that's okay.
If I could circle back to the tariffs. If I understand it right, and I want you to put on your intelligence hat here.
Uh-oh.
Okay, here we go. With Canada and Mexico forming new economic alliances, the 27 countries of the EU are forming firmer economic alliances and also being driven into the arms of China and Africa. What is the need of the U.S. now? I mean, we're losing our intelligence portion of it from our allies. And so, I mean, it's like everything's being ripped apart, and we have a president that's sitting there saying, I'm going to negotiate. I'm going to threaten these guys. And you know what? I think they're already giving the president the middle finger.
Well, so this is something that we've known about Donald Trump for a very long time, is his style of negotiation is one that favors kind of that bipolar negotiation, right? You and I we're gonna make a deal, and it's just you and I. And that exists in New York real estate, where I got a building, you got money, or I got money, you got a building. Let's make a deal, right? Quite frankly, that's real, and no critique against realtors that are listening. It's kind of easy.
Yeah.
That's not the world that we live in.
Yeah.
And while yes, the United States has the largest single economy, we have one of the highest per capita GDPs in the world, although not the highest. If you look, I think we're like 16th highest per capita. So when you look at the purchasing power of the EU collectively, there are other markets out there. So the U.S. is not the only game in town. And to Donald Trump, this is an environment where he has never, I wouldn't even say he's never succeeded. I don't think he's ever even done a deal that was that complicated.
Yeah.
And this has been a critique of the Trump administration, both now and in the first administration, which is this is an individual and someone who surrounds himself with other individuals who simply do not understand the complexity of the modern world. They are, and again, no offense to New Yorkers or former New Yorkers, but these are people that have lived their entire lives in the swamp that is New York City real estate, and that's how they do business. And I don't know about you, Gary, but not everything's like it is in New York.
Well,
in fact, I would argue
true.
that Colorado is pretty different from New York.
Yeah, well, I'd argue that too. And I've been in business and with my wife and everything like that, and we would never, ever treat a customer the way Donald Trump has treated Canada or Mexico or the EU, because right now, from what I've been reading, is he wanted to reorder the world economy. He is, but not the way he had planned.
No. And, and if you want to look at parallels, a great example is look at the evolution of the economies of Massachusetts and Maine. And I say that because if you go back to the late 70s, Massachusetts had a very robust manufacturing community. If you look at like Lowell Mills, you look at a lot of production that was occurring in and around the 128 belt. And about the 1970s, and Maine at the same time had a robust logging and paper mill industry. So again, manufacturing very focused on those areas. Starting in the late 1970s, this was actually not global economics. This was a demand shift of just the way that the market shifted, and there wasn't the need for those types of things anymore. Policymakers in Maine largely adopted a philosophy of like, well, we're just going to bring the mill jobs back. That's our thing. And for 20 years, every Maine politician was, oh, well, we'll bring the mill jobs back. That's what we're going to do. We'll build policies to bring back the mill jobs. Well, as of 5 years ago, there's no more mill jobs in Maine. They're not coming back. They never were. You look at Massachusetts, and Massachusetts spent a lot of resource in diversifying what was happening. So they invested heavily in technology. Yeah. So you see the healthcare industry really took off in Boston. You see that there is, we all think of Silicon Valley as being kind of the hub of the tech industry. But Boston in the 128 belt actually had a very, very substantial, and still does, has a very, very substantial tech presence. So Massachusetts kind of invested and looked forward and said, okay, the future is not in manufacturing. We're not getting the mill jobs back. So let's figure out what the next thing is, and let's get behind that. Well, and that's where Massachusetts now competes globally, is one of the most competitive markets in the world, despite being one of the smallest states in the U.S. And Maine continues to struggle because their population is just getting older and the job opportunities continue to decline because they've never invested in their workforce. So,
Well,
go ahead.
do you think we could apply that across the United States, though?
Yes. So this gets into my stump speech of if we were really an America first policy looking place, then we would be looking at partnering with unions to develop the workforce. We're dealing with that here in Pikes Peak right now, where the Pikes Peak region has a number of jobs. We're trying across and this goes beyond just El Paso County. Across the Front Range, there is a concerted effort to bring in and expand our aviation and aerospace economy, that as well as cybersecurity. So if you look at the National Cybersecurity Center that exists down there on North Nevada, these are areas that we've tried to make concerted efforts. Are they all going 100% well? No. But one of the areas that we're falling short is on the workforce development side. And this is an issue that when you talk to economic developers is really the area that is going to define the modern economy. Things move so quickly now. And a lot of this is coming from both the work I do now, which I do a lot of work in economic development, and the work that I've done in the past with workforce development and some of the stuff that I do as in higher ed. So working with on the Norwich Alumni Association board to support the work that's happening in higher ed. All three of these, the common thread is that, and I'll use myself as an example, right? The first resume I wrote had the number of words I could type per minute on it, because that was the standard acceptable way of saying, hey, I know I can work in an office because I can type whatever the words per minute was supposed to be.
Was that a manual typewriter?
I think it might have been. Then you move into, well, now you have to be Microsoft Office proficient. And that's kind of, we're in this hybrid phase of, for the past 10 years, standard thing to put on a resume is, oh, I'm Microsoft Office proficient, which a lot of people over-exaggerate. Let's face it. If you can't figure it out, look, we got problems. Now, if you go down and look at some of the work that the Pikes Peak Better Business Bureau is talking about, if you don't understand how to leverage AI in your workflow, whatever it might be, you are going to fall behind. How do we do that? You have some people that are just like, man, this is really cool. I want to play around with it. I love playing around with my ChatGPT. I use it all the time, and I have found it to be tremendous. But no one's ever taught me anything about it. I just screw around with it and have figured some things out. If we want a competitive workforce, we have to invest in that. And the two models that exist that talk about lifelong learning, the military, which has a very structured system of you go to training, you do 2 or 3 jobs, you go back to training, 2 or 3 jobs, back to training. And the unions have always been a place where you give the union members the opportunity to upskill. And yes, the Reagan coalition highlighted the fact that in the 70s and early 80s, there was a lot of corruption in the unions. And rightfully so, it was cut back on.
Right.
But if you go down and you talk to some of the labor leaders in our own community today, what you will find is a very robust culture of growth that invests in the workforce within their trades. We need something similar in other industries, because if we want to compete, we need to be investing in the workforce so that our workers are competitive. How many times have you talked to folks that say, well, oh, we have all these job openings, but no one's qualified to fill them?
Right.
That's a skills gap. That's an area that you have to invest. So if we really want to say we're putting America first, invest in American workers. That's where you will see the gains.
That when Bill Murray was doing his podcast, Council Matters, that was one of the topics that came up, is the reason companies aren't coming here is we don't have the trained, educated workforce for their needs.
Yep.
And so they move on to somewhere else.
And that's not a critique on people. That's not saying we're uneducated.
No.
It's saying there's a skills misalignment, and that can be corrected.
And I think one of the things that came out with UCCS here was not aligned with the skills that are required for new companies. Because one of my favorite things I like to ask when it comes to investing in Colorado Springs is, how much money of direct foreign investment has been brought into Colorado Springs? And it's deer in the headlights. So, I mean, I know that we're getting close to the end here.
I know. You dump foreign investment on me with 30 minutes and 50 seconds already on the clock.
I need you to put on your Jeff Crank hat.
I don't have a dunce cap near you. I'm sorry.
I have the Jeff Crank questions here.
Oh, boy.
Does Jeff Crank support Congressman Comer's bill that would defer all congressional power to the executive branch?
This is giving all congressional power to the executive branch?
Yep. Congressman Comer of Kentucky has got this legislation swirling around in the House. And, I mean, it's become a hot topic. In fact, when Comer was questioned about his legislation, he could not answer. He could not tell the Inquirer what his legislation was hoping to accomplish. I mean, it's that bad. And, of course, Crank is a go-along, get-along guy. But the second thing, since we're a military town, and Jeff Crank boasts about getting the military housing under private control or something like that, which has been a big mistake. What are Jeff Crank's thoughts on the president not attending the transfer of the 4 U.S. Army soldiers at Dover Air Force Base and instead played golf at one of his courses in Florida?
Well, but Joe Biden looked at his wrist at one of those.
He did what?
That's what they're all saying, right? They're, oh, well, you know, when Biden went to one, he just looked at his watch.
Oh, really?
That's the counter.
Okay.
So let's be fair.
Of course.
With the dignified transfer ceremonies,
yes,
the president does not always attend. It is not really a formal ceremony.
Right.
So I would say the president not showing up shouldn't be a story. Okay? Taken in totality of all the things that were happening last week on Thursday, the fact that the President of the United States chose to spend $10 million of taxpayer money so he could go sit with the Saudis and golf.
Right.
That speaks volumes.
Yes.
Volumes to the area that he focuses on. If he was sitting in the White House dealing with economic issues and didn't go to a dignified transfer ceremony, I would not be upset. And that's not because I disvalue it, it's just because I understand what that ceremony is.
Yeah.
And I know that they happen and the president does not always go, and that's okay.
It's the optics.
It is. This is an optics thing of you made a unilateral decision that, by the way, constitutionally, you are not allowed to make.
Mm-hmm.
The economy, by the way, to quote President Trump, if the economy drops 1,600 points in a day, the president should resign, which apparently he did because he went golfing. So clearly he's not making those decisions. He just said, well, you know, I shouldn't be, even he agrees. I can't make these decisions. Clearly I should just be on the golf course dealing with the Saudis.
Okay, I've got one last quote here, Joe.
Mm-hmm.
Pick this up. I was just amazed that I found this thing. It was called A Manifestation of America's Festering Ignorance Epidemic. So, okay, Joe, any last words? We're way over time, but that's okay.
Never in the history of the world have the people that banned books been the good guys.
Yeah.
That's my counterquote.
True.
That's my counterquote. Never in the history. If you're banning books, you have never been on the right side of history.
Okay. Well, we've concluded another episode of Joe Reagan's Conversation. And before we sign it off, Joe, twice your website.
ReaganForColorado.com. ReaganForColorado.com. We are trying to get out about every other week email blast. And I've been hitting the ground pretty hard with some events. So I hope to see folks out there more and more.
Okay. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks.